Okay, so before we go too much further, what I would like to do is ask you if you remember this from last week. Essentially, we talked about this last week as a process that is really important to consider. You know, research is a process, it's not a product. And I think that's the first thing that we have to remember. The second thing is that research is not easy for anybody. It may be easier for some, but I think we as examiners recognize that. And I know you as supervisors and faculty recognize that as well. But again, for our students in the crowd, this is that third tip that we talked about last week. You got to have 3 before we see it, right? This idea that everything you do should have at least 3 other sets of eyes before it gets to us as internal or external examiners. So please, please, please keep those in mind. And now here is the quiz section. If you did attend last week's session, will you just put a little Y in the chat box? If you did attend last week's session, put a yes or a no. If you did not, put N, that's okay. I want to see how many people were there because again, we're going to have a little quiz now. This is going to be exciting. Okay, so we've got lots of people who were here last week. Now, one of the things that I did at the last week is I said there's 4 questions or 5 questions that I ask students before they begin and that students should ask themselves. Students, the faculty, you don't have to answer this one. You get a free pass on this one. Students, what were the 4 or 5 questions you should ask yourselves before we begin? Does anyone remember? And by the way, if you answer this correctly, Myra said she will buy you lunch. So it's very exciting. Again, students, I know sometimes when we're students, we don't get quite as much food as we would like. So yeah, Myra will take it up. Does anyone remember? If you remember, just throw it in the chat box. And if you don't remember, take better notes. That's my first tip for you, right? Take better notes because these are the things that are important, right? So there were 4 questions that we talked about. Number 1 was, do you know the field and its literature well? Right? Before you start a research project, do you know a field and its literature well? The second one was, what are the important research questions in the field? The third was, what areas need further explanation? The fourth was, has this study been done before? Right? Now, the reason I asked this is as an external examiner, these are 4 of the questions that I'm looking for from the start. You know, do you really know the literature in the field? When you're presenting your case, have you really studied it? The second thing is, what is your research question? Is it a well-formulated research question? Because everything starts from that research question, right? So if it hasn't been well formulated from the start, then we may have some errors there. What areas need further exploration? And again, this is where you should start at, but it's also where you should end at. I don't want to be examining something that I know has been done multiple times in multiple contexts. Don't just recycle used knowledge, right? Like that's not the point of becoming a doctorate. You're supposed to be an expert in new knowledge. And finally, has this study been done before? If it has been done before, like we said prior, that's okay. But what is this new? What is the improvement that you're bringing? Okay. And so I think those 4 questions are really critical for you to consider as you are preparing your examination as well. At the start of your study, you need to start with these 4. But again, these are kind of things that we're looking for at the end of our study as well. So for faculty members, I also mentioned, and I know Myra, you wrote these down, so you don't have to remember them. That's okay. For faculty members, these are some of the questions that I said that we need to ask, right? We need to ask students at the start, what's the gap in the literature? What's your research question? How are you going to go about answering it? And what will be the impact of your findings? Again, when we get to the examination phase, these are the things that I'm still looking for. And and I'll tell you, I've surveyed some of my colleagues as well for today so that we're going to have wider answers than just mine. But these are really important as a starting point. So I am going to start with me because I have the microphone. So we're going to start with me today. These are the 5 things that I think are really critical. Okay. And again, there's about 25 or 30, but I'll get to some of those other ones later. But these are the most important 5 things that I'm looking for in general when I do an examination. Number 1, details matter. Whether it's APA or MLA or Chicago, grammar, spelling, that stuff matters. And I am one of those examiners that I literally read every sentence of your document. And if you haven't taken the time to do those little things right, my question is, what have you skipped in procedures? What have you skipped when you're looking at your validity and your reliability and the fidelity of implementation? If you can't do the preparation right for this really important event, your Viva, then you may have not done the research correct. So again, details really matter. And this goes back to that idea of, have you had it looked at 3 separate times? Did you hire an editor to make sure that they've read through it carefully? But the first thing is, details really, really matter. Don't think that you can just, well, it's on page 79. They're not going to read that. No. I'm going to be one of those that reads that, right? So make sure that you take time and that you are really careful with your formatting, with your spelling, with all those things. The second thing is your narrative. Have you built a case about why this is important? You know, don't introduce the topic and then take me to the end. Throughout the course of the Viva, I want to see that you've really built a case that over time, you know, this was some of the first work that was done, and then this came along, and this is where the gap is, and this is how I'm feeling it by this study, etc. But you've got to make sure that you build a case, and that is both in your written work and in your oral presentation. Okay, that's really important. I want to see that it kind of flows together and that I can see that there aren't any major gaps there. The third thing, and this is something that may be more specific to me, I personally want to know, what have you pulled in from other fields? Nothing exists in a vacuum. And so context of every study matters. When we talk about, you know, if you look at the work that Myra and I are doing right now, you know, studying disability in the UK is very different from studying in the UAE. If I don't look at some of the cultural influences, if I don't look at the geographic influences, if I don't look at things like the weather, all that matters, all that impacts. And so I really want to understand that you've looked at greater context. That doesn't mean that you have to write a lot about it, but it does mean that it has to be addressed in some way. The fourth thing that it really comes up for me is this realistic? And I'll tell you a little story. And this happened in good old Singapore days at NIE. The very first examination that I did, I was an internal examiner. I had just gotten my PhD. I just started there as a faculty member. The very first examination, it was, I was one of the examiners and there were 3 others. Again, I was an internal. And the chair of the panel was this, I hesitate to ever use the word older, this very wise, very, very wise, kind of stern Asian man who sat there. And she went through this presentation, really great, laid everything out as far as really great composure, and, you know, the document flowed and she had written it well, and she was clearly confident in what she was talking about. Got to the very end and he said, I just have one question for you. How realistic is that a teacher is actually going to do this? She had this great intervention, but it was fine when it was in a lab setting. If you take that same intervention into a classroom with 24, 25 kids, there's no way that they would be able to do this. And his point was, this is great, but this is not realistic, right? And so this is one of the questions that I actually always ask now when I do an external examination. Is this implementation? Is this intervention? Is whatever you're adding theoretically, you know, does this actually matter? Is this actually something that can be done, or is this just knowledge for knowledge's sake? Now, I'm not saying that that's never important, but you need to be able to justify why it matters, right? The final thing that I always ask is, and I think this is probably more important as an internal representative, is would you be a good representative of this university and of me? If someone goes through and they get their PhD, or they get their, in some cases, their master's degree, and they're out working in the industry, and they say, oh, well, who did you work, you know, where did you go to school? Who did you study under? I want to make sure that by the time that they're out, that they're a good representative of our university. So again, you know how high our standards are at UCL and IOE. Someone who gets out with a PhD from IOE, you've been through the ringer, right? We're pretty sure that you're going to represent the university well, and further, that you're going to represent me well. Because if they say, you know, who'd you study under? Zachary Walker, and then they think that that work is a bunch of crap, well, that, you know, I don't want that on my name either, right? So that's the 5th question. So those are 5 questions that I'm really concerned with in general going into an examination. Okay, now we're going to get into some more specifics, but before we do that, I'd like to ask the students, what are you most nervous about in this process? Throw it in the chat box. And faculty, if you remember what your experience was like, right? If you're a new faculty, or if you've seen lots of students go through this process, please answer for them. What are some of the most common things that we get nervous about when we're talking about the examination process? Throw those in the chat box. As we mentioned last week, I believe in wait time. So I'm just going to take a sip of water and relax for a couple of minutes while we have people put some answers in the chat box. What do we get most nervous about when it comes to these examinations?
Go ahead, dear graduate students. Please feel free to write down some of your anxieties. We're not going to judge you.
No, of course, of course. And again, faculty members, please feel free to put thinking, what have you seen? What have you seen from your students? What do you see currently? Worried about not knowing the answer? Thank you for being honest there, Rachel. That's a great input. Anybody else? We got to have at least 3 answers. Got to have at least 3 answers. So I'm not moving on until we get 3 answers. And I'm an incredibly stubborn and patient person. Unexpected questions. Yep, I think that's a really good one. If I miss something, yeah, presentation errors. I think that's a really important one. And this is why you want to have 3 other people look at it before it comes in front of us, right? Time restrictions. That's interesting, because you want to make sure you're quite clear. And this is something for students, make sure you're quite clear with your supervisors. How long does this take? How long do I have to present? I've been at places where they had 45 minutes to present. I've been at others where, like right now, we usually give our graduate students 15 minutes. Because we're assuming that we've read everything and they've got 15 minutes, and then we've got about 45 minutes of questioning. But you see what I mean? So make sure that you know in your situation how it's going to go. So good. Yes, all these things are really good things. So what I did in preparation for this is I actually spoke with a bunch of my UCL colleagues. And I said, what are you looking? I asked 4 questions, and we'll get to what those 4 questions were. But this is from around UCL, some of the common themes that came up, right? So the first thing, as I asked, is what is the most important thing you're looking for as an external examiner? And the very first thing, the first theme that came up was clarity. The ability to talk about their work in their own words so as to demonstrate understanding and independent insight. You've got to make sure, and this is, by the way, hear me on this, students, please hear me. And I know other examiners, I think you will back this up. There's a big difference between writing it and speaking about it. And oftentimes, once you start to speak about it, you realize you never practiced that part. You've got to practice speaking with clarity as well. Even if your written word is fine, you've got to practice being able to talk about it. So a little small tip that I do with my graduate students, my master's and my PhD students, is the very first thing we do within the first 3 to 4 weeks is we do what the elevator speech. Have you all heard about elevator speeches? It's that 30-second talk that you've got to give to explain your work. Every time they come in, every time we meet once a month usually as a group, they have to do their elevator pitch. And they refine it over time, but I want them comfortable talking about their work. So that idea of clarity. The second thing is coherence. So again, another theme that came up from UCL supervisors was this idea of, does it flow together? Is there a precision of the argument? Is there a narrative that ties things together? Are they clearly building on past research? The third thing that came up, what's the contribution? Is it actually adding something new to the literature? And so this is what we want to see as examiners. And then the fourth thing is quite simple, but this basically says what it is. Is it publishable? By the time you're writing it, there should be at least 1 or 2 or potentially 3 articles that are publishable out of your thesis. And now, again, this is where you work with the supervisor to figure out how you're going to take this 200, 300, 400-page document and turn it into 3 articles. But the quality of the writing should be to the point where you could publish this work in some kind of journal, right? So that was the first question I asked, was most important thing you're looking for. The second question that I asked is, what's the most common error you see out of candidates? The first one was, is it a good research question? Oftentimes, and now, by the way, this falls on supervisors a lot, right? Because the supervisor should have guided a good research question and should have helped the student get there. But one of the first themes that came up was that the research question wasn't good to start with. And so we want to make sure at the start we spend a lot of time on the research question and make sure that we've got a really good research question as we get going. The second thing is, yeah, and then I think the thing you put in there, is it answerable, right? That's a starting point as well. And so I've actually got a very specific formula for how I put research questions together for students. Now that may tweak, that may change, but as supervisors, we've got to make sure that we're really doing a good job guiding them through that. What is that very first step, right? What is our very first step, which is that research question? It's got to be solid. Because if it's not, and they spend, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years studying this question that's a faulty foundation, that shows up when you get to the Viva with the external examiner. The second thing is both depth and breadth. Oftentimes what people mentioned is that they will see someone who, goes really, really deep into this one specific area, but doesn't know anything else around it. Or people who know quite wide, but haven't gone deep enough into that specific area. So combining both the idea that you understand the greater context, but you're really specific and have explicit knowledge about this topic is really important. The third thing is lack of criticality. And I actually have had some conversations just in the last couple of weeks with our couple graduate students who are really struggling with, how do I become a more critical thinker? How do I become, and because that's a hard one. And I would love to hear anybody else's opinions on how they teach critical thinking. There's lots of things that we do, but one of the first things I tell my students is you've got to just read more. The more that you read in the field and the more you analyze each particular article, the more that you will be able to be critical about whatever it is you're working on. So I think that that's really critical. You've got to get deeper into the literature within that field, and potentially, again, not just that field. Maybe you have to go a little bit wider to understand greater context. But that criticality is a really big error that we see. And finally, the most common error is transparency. Don't try to hide things. We'll know, right? If you don't know something, just own that and say, I hadn't thought about that before, or that's interesting, that hasn't come up. But don't try to hide things, because as soon as you try to hide things, you're going on the defensive, and you can't do that, right? So, and please feel free to put anything in the comments. I see we've got some really good comments coming in there. So then the third thing that I asked was, what's one tip that you have for students? So again, across UCL, what are just one tip that you have? Again, this idea of details matter. They really, really matter. The second thing is practice until you're confident. Now, this is key, students. Don't just practice. Practice until you're confident. There's a big difference there, right? You can say, oh, well, I practiced. But if you haven't practiced to the point that you feel like when you walk in that room, whether it's a virtual room or a live room, that you own in it, then that doesn't count. Practice until you're confident. The third point goes back to this idea of transparency a little bit. Don't be defensive. There's going to be revisions. There's going to be challenges. That's what we're here for as external examiners, especially. Expect that. Expect there to be challenges. And you know what? We also sometimes, I'll ask questions sometimes just to see how they'll respond. It's not even necessarily the content of the answer. Again, one of my major things is this a good representative of the university? And so I want to see, when they are challenged, do they answer confidently? Are they able to come back? Or do they get defensive? And, or do they say, you know what, I don't know that. That's a really good question. I'm going to have to look at that further, which is a perfectly acceptable answer. But I want to see how they're going to handle the challenges and the revisions that we offer. Again, the fourth one there, it's okay to say, I don't know. And then the fifth one, be clear and coherent. And this is especially, this can be a challenge. And again, I don't mean anything bad. If you're presenting in your second or your third language, you want to make sure that you spend even a bit more time practicing sometimes, because you want to make sure that you're really clear and coherent. And that goes back to the most common errors we see. Oftentimes, clarity and coherence aren't necessarily that you don't know, it's that you're not explaining it well. And again, this just comes from practicing the oral examination and the written, as well as, just knowing it in your mind. You've got to be able to communicate it really well. So for faculty members, I also asked my external examiners, what tips would you give for internal examiners or faculty members? Your attitude matters is the first one. Start by smiling and saying, this is going to be a professional conversation today. We're really excited to be working with you through this process. We can't go at it like we're there to get you, right? And if you come in stern and angry, that's just going to get them more nervous anyway. So, we can start with the smile. One of the things I always say is challenge people with a hug. Now, I don't mean that in any other way than the fact that you can smile and still challenge them. I can have a smile on my face and a glint in my eye and still be very serious about how serious this topic is. You've got to, balance that tone, but it doesn't have to be mean. It doesn't have to be this horrible process. This is a learning process that we're going through together. The second one, read the document, all of it, actually read it. Sometimes as an external examiner, I will read these documents and I'm like, did they not have any supervision? Like, did the supervisor never look at this? This is horrible. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but if you're an internal examiner and you're going to be inviting someone out, that's a reflection of you as well, right? And so you've got to be willing to spend the time reading the document before it goes out. Every word, every sentence, every period, every paragraph, all that has, I just did one, this was before New Year, so I think it was November. I just did one and I found within the first maybe 50 or 100 pages, 47 or 50 grammatical errors. Now remember, I'm that guy who is going to read it word by word. Not every external examiner is going to do that, but I'm one of those. And that said to me a lot about the quality of the supervision, not just the student. And so as an internal examiner, make sure that you've really read it carefully. Be kind. Again, we can be kind, but, and Myra, I'm thinking specifically of a student that you had when we were in Singapore, that, this particular student ended up doing well, but didn't make it through the first Viva process. And there were 4 of us, I think, on the panel, and 2 were quite harsh with her. And 2 of us were a bit more like, okay, this is not quality, but you can get there. And again, you can still have high standards, but be kind about it. And then the 4th thing I think is just a general idea, and it's just a general mindset. What can I learn today? I go into Vivas literally thinking, I'm excited. This is a lecture from a colleague. What can I learn today? And I think if you go into it with that mindset, it helps us remember that this is a professional conversation. Doesn't mean that we're going to, again, lower our standards or anything like that. It means that we can go in and have this mindset that we're here to learn as well, right? So, colleagues, what's your biggest piece of advice? So for other examiners, I know we've already had a couple put in there. This is the faculty when you get to enter the sandbox and play a little bit. What's your biggest piece of advice? If you could put that in the chat box. Yes, I see that. Don't always trust APA generators. They make mistakes sometime, and this is why you've got to read it. Don't just trust, Turnitin software. You're an expert in your field. You're a scholar in your field. That's why you've got to read it to make sure that you understand. But colleagues, what's your biggest piece of advice for each other or for students? Let's take a couple of minutes and throw some things in the chat box. Biggest piece of advice. Waiting. Patience. Yeah. I think patience is a big one. Patience with our students, and in some cases, patience with ourselves, right? I love this. I love the way you phrase this here, Myra. Love it, own it. You know, one of the things that I was told when I was going through this process is, you know, by the time you walk out of here, you should be the expert in this. Act like you're the expert in this, right? And part of being an expert, is all of us know who are faculty members, we all know that, like, part of the, you know, it's that old saying, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. You know, and so part of being an expert is understanding what you don't know and being able to own it, but own what you do know. Be confident about that. Present that. Yeah, don't hesitate to ask. Absolutely. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to continue to think about where you can get better. Yeah, I like this. The purpose is not necessarily just to pass. It's to immerse and to continue to learn. Building rapport. Yeah, I guess I think it's Sheila. Thank you. Managing your time. Have deadlines ahead of time, but also put that into your prep. You know, have deadlines for your prep. For example, if you've got a big, let's say you're a Viva, your examination's in 3 weeks. Well, don't start preparing the week of, right? You start preparing a little bit every day and think about a little bit every day and put that into your diary, put that into your calendar. So Afaf, Dr. Manzoura, know the depth of students' work, help students learn what they don't know, right? So I think all these are really, really good good tips. And Myra, I hope that because this is recorded, people can go back and, you know, pull some of these up as well. So I'm going to just give about 3 or 4 more slides, and then we can open up to a conversation. What I did do as part of preparing for this is I went and I looked on the internet. I said, what do we need to know about external examining? And The Guardian actually had an article that came out just a year or 2 ago. And here were some of the tips that came out from random external examiners from around the world. So beforehand for students, check your institutional policies and practices. Again, know what is expected of you, know what's expected of your supervisor, know what the format of that process is going to look like, from you know, turning in the actual document to the actual oral presentation. But really think about, do you know, does something have to be in 3 months ahead of time? Does it have to be in 1 month ahead of time? All that stuff as far as the written work goes. From the time you turn in the written document and it's sent out, keep an eye on the literature. There might be 3 or 4 groundbreaking studies, or there may be some really interesting things that come out in that time between you submission and your oral presentation. Add that new stuff to your oral presentation, to your oral defense, right? So again, don't just say, well, that came out after I wrote it. No, you're supposed to be an expert in the field. Experts in the field keep up with the most recent developments. Know your examiners. So for example, let's say that I was getting ready to examine and I knew that Myra was going to be on my panel. I would look at Myra's bio. I would do everything I could to figure out what her background was, what her field of study was, and that will help me understand her to build a rapport, but it will also help me understand what questions she might ask. Knowing that she has such an interest in literature, I would probably be thinking about, okay, does my study at all tie in literature? Is there a quick little joke that I can reference? Or you see what I mean? But as soon as you know who your examiners are, know their work. Even if it's a little bit unrelated to what you're doing, know who they are, know your work, because that helps build familiarity, but it also helps you be able to link things during your oral defense. I love this last question. What is worth defending? There's going to be certain things that you might be asked about that you just say, you know what, I'm willing to not argue this point. And you know what? Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a really good point. It's definitely a different way of looking at it, and I'll consider it further. Knowing to yourself, you may think that's a bunch of rubbish, but understand what is worth fighting for and what's worth saying, you know what, I'm going to have to consider that further. I'm going to have to think about that differently. Sleep, eat, exercise. Are you giving your brain the best chance to succeed? And this is one of those things I think we often glorify, not, our hard work and how hard we work and all that stuff. And I'm going to say this real quick. And this point, as I think I'm actually going to stop sharing, because I think this point, and then I'm going to come back to this, but I want, if you could just turn your cameras on for just a second, if you feel so comfortable. I really want to see your faces on this, because this is a really, really, really important point. So if you're here, if you could turn your camera on just for a second, because this is important for students, but it's also important for us as faculty. Are you ready? This is a really important point. Exhaustion is not an accomplishment. Does everybody hear that? Being exhausted is not some great accomplishment that you can hang your degree on. Get sleep, eat right, exercise. We know how important those things are for our brains. If we want to do our best work, we have to make sure that we're taking care of our bodies. Does that make sense to everyone? And we have to emphasize this to our students as well. I don't want a student who pulled 3 all-nighters to prep for their Viva, right? I want a student who was a week ahead of time, was done, and has spent the last week just fine-tuning and getting sleep and eating right and exercising. That's the student I want walking into the Viva. So I think it's really important that we emphasize this to students, but the other point on this is we have to be what we want to see. So we can't expect them to get sleep and get exercise and to eat right if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're constantly complaining about the hours that we're putting in. If we want our brains to work in the best way possible, we have to A, take care of our bodies, but we also have to make sure that we're living the example for our students so that when they show up to the Viva, they are well taken care of. Does that make sense to everyone? I think that that's a really important point, that oftentimes in academia, it's like we hang our hat on working so hard. Take some time for yourself, relax, have a cup of tea, go for a run. You know what I mean? Whatever you need to do, but you've got to be willing to step away and recharge, because your brain's not going to work as well if it doesn't. And obviously you all are scholars, there's lots of neuroscience behind that. But I think it's a really important point that I wanted to just make sure that we all hear. Okay. So last few tips here, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. For students, drop a list of possible questions, especially the ones you're going to hate. If you know that there's, again, some potential weak spots in your, be honest about those. Don't tell the audience that those are the things but be prepared for those questions. Don't just ignore it. Because remember, your examiners are really smart too. And they're probably going to be able to figure out what you're trying to hide. So you might as well be prepared with that question and prepare yourself for that question, especially if you think, I don't know how to answer this, or, whatever it might be. That's the question you need to be especially prepared for. Practice your answers out loud. We've already talked about this. There's a big difference between the written word and the oral and the spoken word. Make sure that you have actually practiced saying it. When I started giving lots of talks, one of the best things I heard was talk it in front of a mirror. Say everything you're going to say in front of a mirror, because A, you have to speak it out loud, but B, you get to see what your face looks like while you're saying it. Now, this is a really uncomfortable experience, but it's also really valuable, right? Know what you look like while you're also saying certain words or while you're using certain phrases. Really important. The fourth one, a very practical tip: bring an exact copy that you gave to the examiners. Bring one for yourself. So that way, if they say, on page 109, I noticed this, you can actually look at exactly what they're looking at, that you're not like, oh, well, on my draft, it's a different page, or you see what I mean? Like, have the exact copy that you've given to the examiners. Last couple of tips here: during the actual Viva, start strong. Be really detailed at the start. That will gain the confidence of your examiners. If you come out strong and you talk very detailed about some minutia or the methodology, or you're quite clear at the start, that will show us that, okay, you might be fooling us, but still, that's okay, right? Start really strong. It's going to give you confidence, but it's also going to give us confidence that you know what you're talking about. Be comfortable with silence. It doesn't mean bad news, right? Sometimes examiners just have to think through things as well. use that silence to think through, okay, what else have I not talked about? What would I like to emphasize? How can I make that connection with Myra that I know is into literature, right? Like you constantly want to be thinking, don't let that silence unnerve you. Think about your phrasing, right? So if you say something, it's much better to say, oh, well, I just didn't know that. Or it's worse to say, I just didn't know that, as opposed to like, well, I hadn't considered that. That's an interesting take. You see what I mean? So think about how you're phrasing things, because you want to come across as confident and as a scholar. Focus on your contribution to the knowledge. Again, why does this study matter? And then finally, the last tip is try to enjoy it. As silly as that might sound, this is one of those things you've been working for years. And yes, when you walk out, if you've passed and you get your degree and you get your hood and you do all those things, that's all exciting, right? But you would hate to have that and think back to how miserable your Viva was. So like, enjoy it, right? Like enjoy the process. So I would like if you could just in the chat, and then we'll open it up in the last 20 minutes here to just talk. I would love to hear any of the things that have really stuck out to you today. It could have been something that you learned from someone else in the chat. It could have been something that we said, but one tip that we've talked about specifically today that you think, yeah, you know what, that makes sense, or that might be helpful. And it could be for a student, it could be for one of my colleagues, one of the other examiners here. What's one thing that has really stuck out to you and that you feel like, yeah, that makes sense to me? So let's go ahead and put those in the chat box, please, and then we can discuss and open it up for some conversation. Giorgio, it didn't make sense to me at all, but I loved it. I was like, yeah, I agree with that one. That one's really good. I think that's important. One reflection on today. Yeah, humility, grace, composure. The willingness to silence is okay. To try to enjoy this experience. Thank you, George. Yeah, I think this one, Ali, that you put down, trust yourself in your work. And again, this is partly your supervisor's responsibility, right? They've got to ask you the tough questions before you ever get to the external examination phase. Hopefully they've pushed you through it well enough that by the time you get there, you do feel confident and you can enjoy it and trust it. But I think that that's really important. I think, yeah, striking a balance between knowing and not knowing and being able to handle that balance is really, really important. It's really, really important. You can be Batman if that's your thing. That's fine. I get that. I think that I want to go back to this point, though, about the balance between knowing and not knowing. And I'm going to just throw that up there. Again, this presentation is part of the resources, is part of the same thing that I gave you last week. So it'll be in that same folder. But if you weren't here last week or you'd like access to those resources, you've got the QR code there, as well as the bit.ly code. So please go ahead and take those down if you would like to. I want to come back to that point, though, about the striking the balance, because I think that that's really, really, really an important one. Improve your final contribution. Good, good, good. And again, if you want to find me, you can always find me on Twitter or email me if you want to talk about these things further. But I'm going to stop sharing now because I'm lucky to get to work with you all multiple times. So, okay, I'm going to turn that off. If you want to engage in some conversation, that would be great. Feel free to turn your camera on, or if you just want to put it in the chat. But I do think that there's something really valuable there about this idea of balancing, right, between what you're confident in and what you're willing to fight for, and then the being humble and the humility. And again, this sometimes is a cultural thing, right? If you know culturally that you come from kind of an unassuming culture where you're supposed to take a back seat, you know, that's okay, but that your Viva is not the place for that. You, again, if we're inviting you into the academy to join us as a world leading expert, you've got to have some confidence about you. So that self-deprecation, all that kind of stuff doesn't necessarily work. There's a point, and at the same time, you know, if you are a strong male who's been born to walk into a room and lead the room, then it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. That can, so that balance, that also comes down to knowing yourself. It's knowing your content, but also knowing yourself, right? And knowing how you come across in these settings. So, okay, I'm going to open it up to questions, ideas, concerns, funny jokes. Yes, yes, yes. Hi, Giorgio. Hello. Oh, I think your mic, you're muted. There we go.
Yeah. All right. Since I have a question, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'm like you. I like silence.
Mm-hmm.
Being in the US since 1982, I have found out that some faculties see that as a weakness.
Right.
And sometimes if the student is silent, they're going to punish them. Basically, they're going to use it again against them.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments on that? But I am like you. I like silence. Take some time to think about it because it's an experience.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think that it depends if the silence comes from faculty, because you know sometimes we'll be thinking about our next question, or if it comes from the student. So what if you're a student and you need time to think? I would just say that, right? You know what? That's interesting. If it's okay, I want to think on that for a minute.
Yeah.
But I think it's all about how we frame it.
If I may add, it's about the students being silent.
Yes.
And some faculty use it against them. Not all of them. Most of us are like you, but some of them, somehow they see it as a weakness.
Well, and that's why I think we, as a student, really make sure you frame that correctly. You know what I mean? In the sense, if you know that you're going to need to think about it, just say, you know what, I'd like to think about that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a really good question. If you can give me a second, I want to think through that.
Yeah.
So that, you know what I mean? So that you have time to prepare your silence and frame your silence. And I think that's, you know what, that's, as we all know, that's a life skill, right? How we frame things. It's not just a Viva skill. Like when we go into our bosses, you know, the way that we talk about things is usually about framing as opposed to the actual content. And so this idea of how we frame silence, how we frame content is critical. And I think it's really important. So thank you for pointing that out. I think that that's a really, really good point, Giorgio. Thank you. Afaf, Dr. Manzoor, you hand up? Yes, please.
Wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, especially you talk both ways on the views from the student side and from the examiner side. So I would like to share one thing from the point of view of external examiners. As in our country and most of the countries, we have a system for external examiners from some developed countries. So what I see, or what in overall universities face or students face, is that most of the times we send our dissertations to external evaluators like from USA or from UK or from other countries. So what we face, or our students face, that you know, you were talking about very right about the cultural and the contextual things. So what happens, I mean, from like, if I talk about special education or the disabilities studies, so there are like different streams or acceptance of disability list in our country or in our laws. So that's different there in some other countries. So while we do as an external examiner, we must consider the context and the situation, or you can say the cultural differences of that. So sometimes the examiners give those points, or sometimes they do not understand the cultural context of the country and they give their output on that. So it's very important. You highlighted a very good point that we must consider this thing while we are examining some like work. And one more thing that I'm very much on that point with you, that that's important to look for the AP and the grammars. But most of the times, what others, few of the examiners do, that they stress so much on the AP and the grammar that the real sense or the real contribution of the students' work stays damages. So it's very good to hear you. That's my just comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think you said a couple things there. Again, this is that building the context around the study so that whether it's written or oral, so that any examiner, no matter where they're from, can understand the context. And that second thing, again, we want to make sure the details are perfect, but we also can't forget the content, right? The methodology and all that is equally as important. So I think that that balance is really, really critical to consider. So thank you for pointing that out. Others?
Yeah, thank you. If I may, thank you, Dr. Zachary. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. Same as last week, I really enjoyed. So I like also the point of the critical thinking and thinking broad and in depth at the same time. This is what we are looking for our students. And I believe this is a point that we need to explore further with our students. So based on your experience with the UCL students, what advices would you use in terms of what additional tools? I'm sure every faculty member has a number of tools to stimulate this critical thinking broadly and in depth at the same time, which might be different one to another. But can you share with us your experience with the UCL students? What tools would you advise for us to implement? Thank you.
Yeah, no, so this is always one of those things that it can be a struggle depending on certain things. I will tell you what I do, and I'm sure that other people have better suggestions even perhaps. But I mentioned that I have both my master's students and my doctoral students. I meet with them as groups once a month. So right now I have 7 master's students and I have 7 doctoral students. I meet with them once a month, right? As a group. So that I meet with them individually at other times, but once a month as a group. So I'll tell you what those doctoral meetings look like, and then you can glean out if anything is helpful to you. We come in, and usually what I'll do after the first couple is I'll start inviting a guest in. So like Dr. Manzoor, who's a postdoc right now with us, is going to start joining these, but I'll bring in other experts from the field who will just sit in and listen. The first thing that each of those doctoral students do is they share what their study's about in 30 seconds or less. So again, it's that idea of the elevator pitch. Then after they share for 30 seconds or less, everybody is responsible for asking one question they didn't understand or one way that they may expand that study. Now, not all of my doctoral students are studying the same exact things, right? There's a few different topics there. So what happens is, for example, right now, one of my students is studying leadership, university leadership. And how do you actually change cultures in universities? I have another doctoral student who is looking at extremism and study skills. But sometimes she will ask him questions which are brilliant because they really make you think outside of just the leadership bubble that he's in, right? So everybody that attends those meetings is responsible for asking really hard questions. And so you do this every month, and over time it starts to help that particular student get an idea of other things they should be thinking about, other critical, and then after that person's done, we go to the next person. They give 30 seconds to tell about what they're studying about. Boom, we just hit them with questions. And again, we do this once a month as a group. And then from there, and then sometimes there'll be other stuff that I'll talk about, procedurals, or remember, make sure that you're doing this on the ethics form. But then the other thing that I do is it depends on where they're at in the timeline. But if I've got 2 or 3 that have started and are ending at pretty much the similar space, they're the ones reading drafts. So they read each other's drafts throughout. So they're familiar enough with the work by that point not to ask some really ridiculous question. And then this is the other thing is, and for supervisors, I don't know how you all handle it. And this isn't necessarily about criticality, but what I have personally found is that students they come to me much more prepared critically. Is I tell each of my students, master's or doctoral students, I will read anything you write 3 times, but that is it. So if you send me your literature review, I'm gonna read it. You can send it to me right at the start when you've written 1 paragraph, but that counts 1 time. If you wanna wait till the end and send it to me closer to the end, but I'm only reading your documents 3 times. Does that make sense? And so, because what I've found, and you may have had this experience too with your students, George, is that, some students, they'll send you a draft every week or something. right? And they expect you to read it. No, I'm reading it 3 times. So you pick carefully when I'm getting it. Now, that being said, when I read it those 3 times, I'm uber specific and uber critical. Like I dive in deep and I'm pointing out grammar, I'm pointing out holes in their reasoning, but I'm only doing that 3 times. And I make that very clear from the start because I want them to come to me with a document that they feel like is ready to be read, as opposed to asking me every week to read another, because that's just such a time drain on us. And when you've got more than 1 or 2 students, it's impossible to give that level of commitment. So I tell them 3 times now, but when I read it, I'm going to read it in depth each of those times. So, but I think that exercise that we do with monthly meetings and them shooting questions at each other is really helpful for the critical piece.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
We have our master's coordinator with us, Dr. Ali Shahade.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ali.
Thank you, Zachary, for the wonderful talk. Yeah, just my experience with reading, multiple readings. I collaborated with Birmingham University for 14 years, and we were encouraged to read only twice, once in pieces and portions, and once at the end as a whole dissertation. And when I tried to apply this to our context here, this didn't work at all. Really, I have to work anything between 4 to 6 times, in pieces. And like you, I say to my students, do not submit a paragraph or a page here and page there. I will not do that. So send me something like substantial portion. It would be chapter, half a chapter, major section of a chapter. And then I would be happy to read it for the second time. And the third time, if at all needed. But what really is happening is I'm reading it minimally 3 times before I get to the final version, and whereby I read it a couple of times to get it into good, publishable, acceptable, shape. So really, again, the context varies, because if you are dealing with non-native speakers, it's different from dealing with native speakers of English. And, and if people, they come to you with little background or research methodology, and the basic requirements of research, different from people if they have this background already.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. So thank you for pointing that out. I will say this, because I have multiple students I've got a German student right now, I've got a Greek student, I've got a couple of students from Asia, and then English is not their first language. What I say to them, and this is another thing, I provide them a list of editors from the start. But again, this goes back to that whole idea of framing. I'm going to read it 3 times. Here are a list of resources. So we have a whole writing center at UCL, right? That will not necessarily proofread their work, but will help them understand how to outline it and all that stuff. Here's a list of resources for you to go to. I'm reading it 3 times. And so if you need to read, if you need to have other people proofread it, this is, and one of the things I'm trying to emphasize here is also that they need to be able to collaborate with others. They need to be able to build relationships, with other scholars who are going to proofread them, and then they proofread theirs. So I understand what you're saying, because to be honest with you, I've had a couple of students along the way that I have read it more than 3 times, but it's very rare, because I try to frame it from the start. Here's resources for you to use from proofreaders, from editors. You've got the 6 other students in this group, but I'm only reading it 3 times. And for the most part, they understand that. But it can be a challenge for sure. I absolutely agree with you, especially if it's a second language, or, because academic writing, as we know, is so different than how we're taught to write in schools. Academic writing is like scientific writing is a whole different beast, and that's a whole other topic. So I hear you.
Thank you, Zachary. Yeah,
thank you. And I love your bookcase too, by the way. It's really nice.
Yes, I'm looking at the time, but I know that Dr. Nejum wanted to say something, so perhaps we'll just have Dr. Nejum, and then I'll wrap it up.
At some time, thank you very much, Dr. Walker, Professor Walker. And at sometimes, it's like the linearity of the research. Remember that dissertation is another big hill for PhD. It is more challenging than a thesis at master level where they don't have, like enough information about methodology, for example. Later on, you will find that, like you have to come, like to check on balances in terms of the linear way of, like how the dissertation goes, and the twist that will happen in terms of the data collection, the methodology, and things that at some point they don't go as you are expected.
Right.
So at some point you want to, and this is a big problem in terms of even Dr. Ali knows that, it's like we have to come, it's like to balancing again the whole context, even when we have it as chunks, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, still you have to come and take it as a cohesive. And this idea of linearity and non-linearity of the process itself is very sometimes challenging for students and for also for like supervisors.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I think that's where again, that whole depth and breadth and linearity and understanding that it's both ways is really important. And I agree completely that it's a real challenge.
May I add one little thing?
Go
You can
ahead.
add two.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Zachary, I like the idea of you meeting with your student supervisors once a month and as a group. And this I've been using for the last couple of years with my doctoral students. Right now I have 6 doctoral students and 4 are in the same cohort. So what I would do, I would meet with them collectively, and they will share information. They provide feedback to each other, including my feedback. And then I will meet with them individually as needed. But I'm finding the collective meetings very, very useful, very fruitful, more than you can imagine, really. Sometimes you have perspective that is completely unexpected, so they benefit from each other, and I will benefit from them in addition to my structured feedback. Thank you for that point.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So I really appreciate, and I think they learn to appreciate it because they also don't feel like they're going through it alone, right? There's a sense of community that like, okay, other people are struggling with this as well, and building that sense of community is really important. So I know we are at time.
Professor Walker, I'm just have like one questions for you. It's like I heard about like yoga, meditation, and research. It's like especially when we are talking about critical thinking and like in terms of qualitative way, stretch it to be like a form of a metaphor, or if it is a grounded theory or whatever. Do you think that it is it's like bringing students together? It is a sort of meditation to think and giving feedback, or it is a yoga kind of a thing?
I will tell you about my experience with yoga, and I think that research is somewhat similar. I hated yoga for about the first 3 years. Now I've got to the point where I'm actually like, you know what, this is actually pretty good for me, and I can get into that state of flow that they always talk about. But that was not my experience for the first 3 to 4 years. Like every movement hurt. Everything was a challenge. I walked away and my legs hurt more, my arms hurt more. Everything just felt awkward. After I did it for 3 or 4 years, I got to a point where it was like, okay, some parts are still quite challenging and some poses are still quite hurtful. But overall, my body feels much better for it. And mentally, I'm in a much better place while I'm going through the process. So that's my experience with yoga. I do think there are some parallels. So I actually have to run to another meeting right now. Lovely to see you all again. I look forward to a couple of weeks, which will be a bit different. But thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you
all right.
for being here.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.